Right, right. By trusting. Trusting is proving, right? Yeah. Stepping in trust, in proving, yes, proving, not testing. Very, very, very good. So just to finish that other thought about the problem of pain, there are a lot of ways to look at that, and over the years, a lot of different people have looked at it. Harold Kushner has a big book on it, and a small book, but it's a good book on it, and several others have addressed it. For me, I believe that we have a special, extra measure of truth that clarifies the subject more than maybe anybody else. If we look at the bigger picture, I've told somebody the other day, if I ever write a book, it's going to be called Before and After, and it's not going to have anything to do with weight loss. Before and After, I think it was Ellis we were talking about this. Before and After is going to be the name of the book, and it's going to be everything that we know from Scripture about what happened before the creation of the world, and everything we know from Scripture about what's going to happen after the second coming. Because it seems to me that in those two places are found the answer to the question of pain. The question of pain is a question of why here and now does this life not conform at all with God's character. Isn't that really the problem of pain? Because how do you believe in a God who would let us suffer like this? That's the ultimate question of pain.
We chose to.
Maybe you chose to. Well, there you go. There you go. So it's imputing that whole ancestry thing on me. So, yes, it is. But it has to go back farther than that. Because God could have said, that guy's going to have bad ancestors. I'm not even going to create that guy or his ancestors because I don't want to see anybody suffer. What?
I'm talking about Adam and Eve.
I knew who you meant. And so we have this whole question. That only answers the question back to the first people. And when you get there, then you have to go back to Lucifer. And that only answers the question back to Lucifer. Ultimately, it has to be pinned on God's chest. If it doesn't get back to God, the question is not answered sufficiently. Yes?
I thought about this question extensively recently, and I asked myself, why did God create Lucifer? Because He knew what would happen. And the answer to me, what I decided was, if God only creates those who will follow, then they're like creating robots.
Right. And that's where we're getting to, is he said, and we don't have the choir mics for our watchers at home, so I kind of have to repeat. He says that it goes back to that if he didn't create Lucifer with the opportunity of failure, then there would be no essentially free will. Am I paraphrasing you too far? And therefore there would be really no opportunity to be loving. So the argument, of course, comes down, it's hard to argue the dogs, because the dogs, we feel like they love us, right? It's hard to argue the dogs, but the dogs really are conditioned animals. And so when we get really down to it, the question is, what is the value that God gets in exchange for the life of His Son? That's really what it comes down to, isn't it? Because He suffered, not just we suffer, right? He bought into the suffering, knowing the end from the beginning, knowing what it would cost. He bought into the suffering because He thought for some reason it was worth it. What in the universe makes it worth it? And this is where we get back to Morris Venden. He did it for the relationship.
Of all of His creatures.
Absolutely. Of all of His creatures, fallen and unfallen. And here's the thing that always teases my mind, and Turner can quiz me on this later, but here's what always teases my mind. When we think about infinity, my mind starts to fuzz out and I think I'm going to faint. When I think about infinity, when you think about an infinite creation, if God creates something approaching infinite number of folks that all have the choice, angels that all have the choice, as you approach infinity, every possible outcome is guaranteed. Yes? Everybody with me on this? Yes or no? Yes. So as you approach infinity, every possible outcome is guaranteed. And so Lucifer was guaranteed. He knew it before he created Lucifer.
But it wouldn't have had to be Lucifer.
It wouldn't have been Lucifer, that's right. It could have been any, but he knew who it would be. And in the end, and where it gets so beautiful, is to know, you know, by the way, you know that before he ever had to give his son, that God's heart had to be broken when his covering cherub turned south on him. Anybody here who's ever gone through a divorce or seen somebody go through a divorce, you know the pain that those people feel. I've been through a lot of divorces with people. And I'm telling you, it is the second most painful thing on earth, losing a child followed by divorce. And this whole thing with divorce is just awful. And God knew how awful it would be. I always think of this lady at a church we were at. She was 60-some years old. All her kids were raised and grown, and many of you know them. They're people who are teachers in our system, school system, etc. And she went and adopted 3 little kids and started all over. Whew. That is a heap and help and a courage, isn't it? After you've been through it, it's easy to get teenagers to have babies because they haven't been through it, right? But having been through the whole thing, all the pleasure, all the joy of raising children, and all the pain of raising children, she says, we're going to do this all over again. Wow! That's kind of an imitation, a little bit of what God did when He knew from the beginning how painful it would be to have to divorce from Lucifer, change his name to the adversary, and then find himself in a divorce situation with every one of us because of our ancestry, and then reclaim us by divorcing His own Son. Wow! That's amazing. Yes, Turner. Yeah. Enough to go through all this. Wow. Wow. Okay. So I have one more. What's that?
Don't you think that there is always a risk of giving freedom of decision?
Absolutely.
That's one of the reasons.
Yes. And of course, for us, it's a risk. When you say to your 16-year-old that got the keys, you give them the keys and say, okay, give it a try. You're taking a risk. For God, it's not a risk because He knows. He says, take the car. I know you're going to wreck it. I'm going to love you anyway, and I'm going to fix it. Wow. Wow. That's hard. That's hard. Anybody ever heard Dan Zacharias' story of wrecking his dad's car? He's got a wonderful story. Make him tell it to you sometime. Okay. All right. So there's one more paragraph. This one's from Douglas Stewart. But for the people actually to doubt God's presence among them was outrageously unfaithful. His presence was obviously manifest at all times, as it was at that very time, through the pillar of cloud and fire. So the people's question must be seen as nothing other than a contempt for the Lord's leadership over them. It would be akin to asking a runner in the midst of running a marathon, "Do you intend to run this race?" Or asking a mother while she's in the kitchen working hard to get the family's meal ready, "Are we going to have some dinner tonight?" It is an insult. It looks at the obvious and implies by snidely denying it that it is no good. Israel thus incurred God's wrath and challenged God in a way he could not ignore. Wow, that guy, he writes some great stuff. So if you ever want to buy a commentary, the New American Commentary, fantastic. That guy has some stuff, really good stuff. Okay. Yes. All right.
God has to allow us to divorce Him.
Yes.
Every time we choose to cease trusting Him and obeying Him because of love, we divorce Him and He has to take it.
That's right.
And that's what's broke His heart.
And
Right from Lucifer down.
what Galen said is that every time that we give up our trust in Him and turn from Him, which we do frequently, that He has to tolerate another divorce. Okay, so let's read on to verses 4 through, you think through 7? All right, 4 through 7.
So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?"
Okay, very good. As we read this, it says, the place is Massah and Meribah, which means complaining and testing. Complaining and testing. So that's the name of the place forever. It's mentioned 2 more times in the Bible, once, or 3 more times, once by the name only Massah, once only Meribah, and once together. So they use the names fairly interchangeably. So here comes this weird deal. Now, for us, it seems weird in retrospect, but recognize that it wouldn't have seemed quite so weird to them. So this is a water miracle. And we've just had 2 water miracles, right? The sweetening of the water and the finding of the oasis out there in the middle of the desert, near salt water, which they couldn't drink, right? As they're coming down the side of the Gulf there, the Gulf of Sinai. So if you look at all those issues, you say, well, this is the 3rd water experience, but wait a minute. It's not the 3rd one. You got to go all the way back to the Nile River. He took the same stick and he struck the Nile River and it turned to blood. He took the same stick and he held it up over the Red Sea and it parted. And then he took some wood and threw it in this bitter water and made it sweet. And then they found the oasis. And now he's telling them to whack a rock. Now, I looked up some art pictures and I gave you one, which is interesting. But I found some others, but I couldn't use them because they were a little too dark for what I wanted us to see. Here's all the artists draw this as him walking up kind of almost to a cliff, and he hits up high on the cliff and a waterfall comes out. And I know that that makes it more picturesque for the painting, okay? Because if he hits the rock on the ground and the water comes out, it's hard to depict that, right? But I got to thinking about it. And I got to thinking, yes, maybe that is more fitting. I kind of like what those artists have done because it was up there for everyone to see cross height. Now, here's where it gets really weird for me. These people clearly did not understand that striking the rock was symbolic of the sacrifice of God's Son 1,400 years later. They would have no clue that that had any symbolism for that at all because they couldn't even imagine that when he got there. Yes?
Well, and part of it is this continues. You know, the symbolism is not obvious in foresight.
Right.
The author is not putting the foreshadowing in so that you'll say, oh yes, this is coming.
Right.
We call them bad authors.
Right.
The author is sort of putting in the foreshadowing so that when the event finally happens, you will go, oh, yeah,
Right.
that's what that was about.
Well, and we see it in Acts when he says, and this was the first time that the believers were called Christians. Well, he knows his readers all know that everybody's called Christians now. And so when he says that, this is the first time, it's a foreshadowing of something that they actually had experience of. This is a foreshadowing of something not only did they not have experience of, none of his readers would have had experience. The author didn't have experience of it. So this is God's injected foreshadowing. The author did not get it. He's writing inspired, and he is writing essentially a prophecy or a type for the antitype or an antitype for the type that will come in 1,400 years. And that is, to me, pretty amazing, pretty miraculous by way of prophecy. And Jesus comes back and says, yeah, I was the rock in the desert. That was me. And we go, oh, I get it. Even Jesus' friends didn't get it. He had to tell them. And there is so much in this story that is about that story. Just like whoever, was it Dr. Conrad said, the bread and the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. Exactly the same story as these people out here who are tempted because they don't have bread in the wilderness. Exactly the same testing. Okay, so let's read now. We're going to change from this story, and we're going to go now to the story of the Amalekites, and we'll take it in 2 bites. Let's do 8 through 13, and then we'll do 14 and 15.
Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hand became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword.
Okay, so first, do we know who Amalek is? The Amalekites. Who are they? Esau's descendants. One of the lines of Esau's descendants. Now, if Esau's descendants, think this is 400 and some odd years, right? If they had kept a little bit of track of the prophecy, they would have known that this is not Israel's land and they're not going to be messing with the Amalekites. They're just going to move on through. They didn't have to fight. They were just passing through, and the Amalekites might have known that. The outside scholarship seems to indicate that the Amalekites were people who made their profit from raiding their neighboring peoples. Popular thing to do. And so they would just, if somebody was coming through, they'd go take what they could take from them. Yes, Ellis?
I was just thinking, in a way, when Moses pulled up the rod, victory.
Yeah.
When he lowered the rod,
Yeah.
and that's the same thing in our experience in our lives. If we hold up Christ all the time,
Yes.
it's victorious.
Right.
The minute we forget about him, then we start losing ground.
Right.
So it's basically the same thing. He's the victor.
Right.
As long as we trust in him, and we're holding our hands and our hearts up to him, then we're going to come out victorious.
Sure.
He will help us.
Okay.
in the battle.
Good. And so the Amalekites are a people that live just north of this spot. They have an area that they have settled north of this spot, and they understood the Israelites. Now, we have to read what it says over in Deuteronomy. Never forget what the Amalekites did to you as you came out of Egypt. They attacked you when you were exhausted and weary, and they struck down those who were straggling behind. They had no fear of God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies in the land He has given you as a special possession, you must destroy the Amalekites and erase their memory from under heaven. Never forget this. So apparently, God takes it very seriously when some of the children of Abraham, children of Esau, betray their cousins, and they come and ambush and start attacking the weak and the tired and the exhausted, trying to take advantage of these people coming out of Israel, that God thinks that's pretty bad stuff. This looks like God has put a pretty strong judgment on it. So, he says, we see it that says the rod of God in His hand. I had always, as a child, envisioned Him holding His hands up and He has the rod here like this. But I'm thinking more that He's got the rod in both hands over His head. I don't know why I never thought of that before, but I think that's the better symbolism. And it is exactly as Ella said. The symbolism is that, and the literary language here is that Joshua has in his hand a sword, and Moses has in his hand the staff of God. So here is Moses representatively holding God above him, keeping the place of God correct vis-a-vis Moses. And when the place of God in their lives becomes incorrect, they lose. When it becomes correct, they win. When it becomes incorrect, they lose. And I had always envisioned, I don't know why, I had always envisioned them stacking up stones and putting them under his elbows. But that isn't what it said at all. And so that's a kid's story gone awry. And so what's really interesting is if Moses then sits down, so he's lower, then Aaron and Hur can actually stand on either side and hold his wrists up. And it's very convenient for them. We could act it out here, but I don't think we need to. And so it's convenient for them, and it's comfortable for him, and they're standing there, and who is Hur anyway?
Aaron's son.
Aaron's son? No. Most of the Jewish scholars think that Hur was Miriam's husband. Whether he was or not, we don't know. That's a speculation, but a lot of the folk believe that. Yes, sir?
Just going back a little bit, Amalek, most desert raiders will smash and grab, get what they can, get out.
Right.
So Amalek is still there the next day.
Yes.
Which implies that they don't really think there's any danger that the Israelites can't possibly fight them because plenty of plunder to be had.
And they're right. If you think about that, what he said was that the Amalekites figured this is easy pickings if they stayed a second day, because they certainly wouldn't have stayed a second day if it was a strong force. Somebody else over here had their hand up.
But anyway, I was thinking too that when he was Lord, people would help him. And I think there's a lesson in there for us too. We need to help each other.
When we see somebody's posture not being right with God. Yes. So the interesting thing about all that is that there's more to it than just the question of how would the Amalekites attack this roving band, who would they attack, how would they attack them, and why would they stay the second day. Very important questions. A lot of scholarly commentary on this. What's really interesting about it is that it tells us a lot about Joshua. Joshua is the fighter because he's the young man, right? And Moses is the leader, and he's standing on the hillside. He's the senior guy. Here's what's interesting. He says, choose us some men and go out and fight with Amalek. Now, the way that reads in English sounds a little bit like, pick up a few guys, see what you can do out there. When in reality, what it probably meant was that there was nobody trained to be a soldier. This is generations of slavery, and nobody had weapons. Generations of slavery again. So who knows in this couple of weeks' time, when these Israelites are moving out of Egypt and into the wilderness, who knows if Joshua isn't doing training sessions along the way. When they make camp for the night, when they're there for an overnight, that he maybe is training up some of the men. They've got a bunch of men, but these men are useless in terms of soldiers, right? Some of you in this room have been through basic training, and you know the difference of how you operated after basic training and how you operated before basic training, okay? So you know that there is some training required in order to be a military unit, and these people weren't, yes?
And I think we should remember that they were physically strong because they had been working all these years.
Yes, absolutely. You know, interesting on that strong. My father used to be a Golden Gloves boxer back in the old days. Now, my father was 5'10", 5'7", 8. And so he fought in the super flyweight, or one of those long names of the weights. But he used to spar against much bigger guys. I guess in the boxing thing, you spar with anybody who will spar with you, and you try not to kill them. And so he would spar with much heavier guys. And he lived in Decatur, Illinois, where there was a place called the Mueller Brass Works. Mueller made water faucets, what we call spigots up north, and down here we call them faucets, right? And so brass faucets. He said he boxed against a guy who used to do brass faucets, and the guy's job was to test the faucets. So all day long he would pick up from the assembly line 2 large brass faucets. He would put them onto a sample test thing, and he would turn on the water and turn off the water, make sure they didn't drip, and then he would take them off and put them back and do 2 more. He was huge. Think Arnold, right? He was huge. My father said, if the man had ever hit me, it would have been all lights out. He said, but he was so slow that he never hit me. He said, I would spar with him, and as long as I kept moving, I survived. The day I stood still, I was a dead man. And so he would spar with this guy. So yes, these guys are strong, but it doesn't make you a good warrior to be strong. There are strong people, and there are warrior people. And I think of David. I think of the boy David. I always pictured him kind of wiry, didn't you? When they say he's a ruddy fellow, I don't think Arnold, right? I think somebody skinnier and younger and fresher than that. And yet he was a warrior at heart. And that's what made the difference. So there's an excursus, and we could talk about it very, very briefly because we don't have enough time to really get into it. So this is the first of Israelites' battles where they actually fight somebody. And so this brings up the whole question of what war was like for them. And we see a whole lot of texts that follow that start to shape and define Israel's duties and privileges and operations in terms of war. And some of these that this author, and I'll tell you who the author is because we always want to give credit, Douglas Stewart, same guy that did that last bit, says that the rules of holy war for the Israelites included 1, no standing army was allowed, citizen soldiers. Number 2, soldiers were not permitted to be paid. They did it for their civic duty. That they could not take any personal spoil or plunder, which is absolutely what soldiers lived on in those days. That it could be fought only for the conquest or defense of the promised land. That it was only at Yahweh's instruction could they launch a war. It has to be declared by a priest or a prophet. and that God did the real fighting because the war was always His. It was a cosmic war of spiritual level. It was not their war to fight. It was a religious undertaking involving fasting, cleansing themselves, abstinence from anything that would impurify them, make them impure, and it was an act of obedience. And the goal of war was to completely annihilate anybody who was occupying the sacred land that wasn't willing to become a Jew. There were some exceptions and some mutations, but rapid, decisive victory was always the expected goal. So it's an interesting thought. There's some studies out there. You might want to study that if you want to have a study. Yes?
I just wonder if at Kadesh Barnea that the people knew that they were not fighters and had forgotten, and so they didn't want to go because they had forgotten.
There's no question that by the time they've been through the captivity in Egypt, they were not warriors. They were not soldiers. They were slaves. And the interesting, you mentioned Kadesh Barnea because that's kind of where the Amalekites were coming from, was that Kadesh Barnea area. That's where they were coming down from. Interestingly, that's also currently where ISIS kind of holds sway in Egypt. That northern Sinai Peninsula is occupied currently by ISIS. So, okay, so let's go on. That's a wonderful story. We need to learn more about her, and we will, I think, and we have to recognize that this is also a pure symbolism, but this was a symbolism that I think even the Israelites could get at this point. There's nothing left on this. The proper place of God and vis-a-vis the people is over, is up, is above. Okay, so let's do 14 through 16.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will surely utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have the war with Amalek from generation to generation.
Okay, so I have a map of this on page 7 for you, and I also have on the last piece 2 little pictures. One of them is the whole wilderness journey, the traditional route of the exile. And by the way, this account here, kind of where we're going next, supports the very traditional route. You know, the alternate route, the non-traditional route, has them crossing the Gulf of Aqaba instead of Suez as they cross the Red Sea. And it has Sinai over on the other side in Saudi Arabia. Now that's the alternate. Here's the problem with that. That's the land of Midian. And in the very next chapter, the Midianites, our friends, Zipporah's father, are coming to meet them over here. If they were already in Midian, there would have had to come meet him. Okay? So they came to meet them over here, and we'll talk about that in a second. At the bottom picture on page 8, you see somebody's speculation that this was some sort of Moses' stuff that can still be seen in the sand. I don't know. Whatever. Yes, sir. Yes. We remember them into perpetuity because we've had them written down and put in a safe place so we can always remember that we don't want to remember them. Utterly blotted out, but we want to remember that we utterly blotted them out. Exactly. It's a beautiful irony. The other big interesting part is verse 15. So this is a hard translation. And it says, Moses built an altar and said, "The Lord is my banner." Possible other translation, and it's nearly 50-50 on this one, that it would be "the Lord high and lifted up." i.e., like a banner, right? So the Lord high and lifted up like a banner, or the Lord is my banner. There's nothing that says that there was a banner on the rod, but it was something that the people were seeing. And so a lot of translators want to call that the Lord high and lifted up. And then it goes on to say, because the Lord has sworn to do this. So yeah, we think of flags. Military units have banners more than they have flags. And they have, if you've ever seen a military unit, they have all those ribbons on them. And it becomes quite a big deal with a ribbon for every battle that they fought. And so the official Marine Corps, when you can't see the flag anymore, it's just covered up with all the different battles. And so all of this, this is all very military stuff. But here is Moses calling God the Lord high and lifted up, or the Lord is my banner. So let's go on and see. We've got 15 minutes. Let's do some of chapter 18. See if we can. These are both fairly short chapters, but I don't think we can finish 18, but let's try it. So let's read 18, 1 through all the way down to 6, through 6.
And Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, with her 2 sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And the name of the other was Eleazar. He said, the God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. Now he had said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife, and her 2 sons with her.
Okay, so this is a pretty classic story. You remember before we left Egypt, Moses sent his wife and sons away. He didn't need that distraction for what was about to happen. I don't know if there's some lesson here that if you send your spouse back to their parents, that the parents should bring them back. I don't know how that works. But here's this boy, Jethro, and he says, I have taken care of your wife and sons long enough. Now they're yours again. I always think it's interesting that Jethro heard about what was happening. How did Jethro hear about what is happening? The thing that is never discussed here is that there are caravans, trading routes, and people traveling all over this desert all the time. None of this is a mystery. You remember when Joshua and the gang get to Jericho, and the Rahab says, wow, we heard about that thing at the Red Sea. That was serious doings. We heard about this and we heard about that, and we are all quaking in our boots. So everybody knows. Now that was 40 years earlier. But this is weeks now, and already Jethro has heard that the people have escaped and that God delivered them with power, vigor, and utter destruction of the Egyptians' experience. So here is Jethro saying, they're out, he won, let's go meet him, let's go greet him. And that's exactly what happened. So he comes over from Midian, and he brings Moses' family back to him, and we're about to hear what he does. So let's go, it's a long one, but 7 through 12.
Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God.
Okay, good. So, a couple of really interesting things in this passage. Number one, Moses is clearly prophet, priest, king to these people, yes? There's no question that he is top dog. He's the man. And when his father-in-law appears, he bows to the ground in front of his father-in-law. So I'm going to have to read that when my daughters get married. Yeah, Moses was a very meek man is what he said. You know, I've seen a lot of meek people put into extraordinary positions, and that meekness can fade like a spring flower. and it didn't with him. He clearly stuck with it. Then there are a couple of really salient points here. One is he tells him the whole story. Moses told his father-in-law in verse 8 all that the Lord had done. It could be hyperbole that he told him all that the Lord had done. That would have been a long story, wouldn't it? However, we experience the trust that Moses wrote the better part of the Pentateuch. This is Moses reviewing the story, getting the story set in his mind so he's ready to write it down. He hadn't written it down yet, right? He hasn't started writing. In fact, we start hearing about a lot of writing in the next couple chapters at Sinai. Suddenly there's a lot of writing going on. Maybe he had a scribe following around. Maybe Moses had a scribe that wrote down everything as it happened. Maybe. I would like to think that things were a bit more harrowing than they had time for the scribe to follow Moses around and write down all the words. I think this is Moses' memory with God's Spirit inspiring him. But here is Moses reviewing God's greatness in front of Jethro. And then Jethro responds with rejoicing for all that he had done. And he says in verse 10, "Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hands of Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who has delivered the people under the hands." And then he goes on to confirm everything that we just said about the plagues. Remember, we went on and on when we were studying the plagues about how when God was doing those plagues, he was doing it to embarrass the idols of Egypt. Every one of those was. And here's what he says. He says, "Now I know the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them." It's exactly what we talked about, isn't it? This is God humiliating the Egyptian gods. And Jethro saw it, and Jethro thinks that's awesome. And he's celebrating it. And he celebrates it then with a burnt offering. So we don't yet have the sacrificial system. However, taking burnt offerings and having a meal before the Lord is something they did way back, all the way as far as Cain and Abel. Okay? So this is what they're doing now. It is not yet locked into the sacrificial system. It is now just a burnt offering to God, and they have a meal there before God together. Okay, so let's read 13 through, yes. This is a great story. So whenever your father-in-law comes to your house, he's going to probably have some advice for you. So here it comes. 13 through 16, shall we?
"And so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. So when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, 'What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening?' And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws.
Okay, now Moses hasn't yet received the statutes of God and his laws. So Moses is speaking from his experience of having studied with Aaron and Miriam, we presume, what they knew about God from history. Because remember, we're not talking about Moses just writing Exodus. Moses wrote Genesis too, right? So how much had they lost in the 430 years of captivity? There had to be some review. They had to go to the scholars of their people to get the history so that they could retell the history. Yes, sir?
The other thing to keep in mind is that large chunks of what we see as the laws of Moses we can parallel from other parts of the Middle East much of it. Some of this is customary law for this whole society, the way things work in this world, and Moses is probably reviewing some of that. And God will be reproclaiming some things that they knew or should have known or ought to have known.
Right. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I was thinking that he also had the Spirit of God in him.
Yes. Yes. I mean, he had to, because all this stuff, again, a lot of the stuff from Genesis would have been absolutely lost if it had not been preserved supernaturally through the 430 years of captivity. How else would they know? How else would they know? And so that's very, very hard. I mean, a lot of that had to be stuff. We understand that it was passed from parent to child through song. That these stories from Genesis had been sung from parent to child through all the years back before Abraham even, and all the way down. So that's how they know. So let's go and do, that is the problem with this, but we also know that he's judging, okay? And judging in this sense isn't a bad thing. So let's see if we can go ahead and finish this. Oh, I don't know if we can or not. We've got 3 minutes. We probably can't. We'll have to do Moses' father-in-law's advice to him next time, I guess. 17 is where we'll be. So Moses' father-in-law watches what his son-in-law is doing, and he criticizes it. Is this something that in-laws are supposed to do? But yes. So it is known that it is done. Yeah. Yes. Well, it's interesting. Yes, ma'am. What's that now? Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. We'll do that in a minute. The bottom line on that is that there is an experience factor. I saw a chart a while back that talked about the different generations and their relation to authority, and how the more senior among us in this room, for instance, grew up in an environment in which if your superior said jump, you jump, right? And over the generations, that has become, let's just say, more collaborative. Is that a nice way to say it? And it's really antithetical to the young adults of this era to have somebody just tell them, jump. There has to be a negotiation as to why jumping is necessary and where the jumping should be done, and we should discuss whether or not I want to do the jumping or whether maybe we can find somebody else to do the jumping, etc. And it's a much more collaborative experience. I am not trying to insult any generation. I'm just saying it's different. The experience that most of us who are more senior experienced is the one that's clearly modeled here. Yes, sir.
I was going to say that a chapter ago the Israelites were getting ready to stone Moses.
Yes.
And now they are coming to him to ask.
Yes.
For legal judgments or perhaps marital counseling or I don't know what.
To resolve their disputes. Yes, Galen? Okay. I take it back. That was not respectful. Yes. 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 It's more fun to say he was criticizing, though.
It can be hard to take advice from other people, even when you know they mean well, because they're still saying you're not doing the thing you ought to do, or you're doing something you ought not, and it can come across as criticism.
And since Moses didn't marry until after his 40th year, we wonder how much older than Moses Jethro might have been. Is it possible that Jethro is younger than Moses? An interesting question. Okay, so we're done for tonight, and let's close. We're going to have to close with prayer. Our time is up. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for showing yourself to be above us, and we ask that we would submit our desires, our will, our choices, and our negotiations to your word in completeness, so that your word will be absolute with us, and that when your command is clear, that our response is obedience. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Go ahead. We can go ahead now that we're done.